Going from your last point that you were making about like the older players and how they went about things compared to the newer guys and these different types of leagues, I think that's a good segue to our next topic. So, as far as the next topic, what are we going to be discussing next?
So we had talked a little bit about how certain teams came about and how they ended up being dynasties and how they came to dominate their sports. Okay. Because we were talking a little bit, The Last Dance, and there's just been a lot of talk about The Last Dance, and that spawned a lot of different talking points. One of those being, okay, the Bulls were not that great before Jordan came. So how did they manage to just rise up and become the dynasty that they were? Mm-hmm. Golden State Warriors was another one that we talked about. How did they go from being a pretty bad team to being the dynasty that they kind of currently are? And so, how do we define that dynasty? How do we recognize a dynasty? How do we assemble a dynasty? How does it all happen? And so that's kind of what we're thinking about. So do you have any opening thoughts on this?
I was thinking, it's kind of interesting. I was thinking about the word dynasty, and I was just thinking, like, it's such a powerful thing, right? Like, we talk about dynasties and we kind of like give people these titles as they have like a dynasty or whatever, but like dynasties are really impressive, right? And I think that they should preserve that like really impressive type of mindset, right? So what they're doing should be that way, right? And I was just trying to think about like some of the top dynasties that we've seen, right, that have been regularly known. And some of these dynasties have been strong, went away, came back. Some of them were just momentary, but like things like the Tennessee women's like basketball, right? Like with Pat, like that was a dynasty, right? Like nobody was competing with them, right? And then you had like UConn, right? UConn's dynasty, right? You had the Celtics, like the Patriots. You had the Packers. Ohio State football at one point in time was just like, man, these guys are doing it, right? But then you have Alabama that's just this strong powerhouse. You know what I mean? And I feel like some of these teams could be thought of as dynasties, right? But then you have some that just kind of like, are these dynasties or not, right? Like the Penguins, right? And in hockey, like they're solid, right? They like won. But when you think about it, are you just like, if you think about the hockey history, like, are you thinking about this recent Penguins team, right? Or are you thinking about like the old, like Montreal, right? Thinking about the Canadians, right? So it's just kind of like, what team are you really focused on it? What classifies something as a dynasty? The last thing that I'll add to that I thought was kind of interesting is, what about those teams that were super close, right? Like those teams that were super close to possibly being able to be called dynasty. Do they need any type of recognition? Like that's something that I would like to chat about as well. But I think that some of those concepts are pretty interesting. And another thing that I would be interested in touching is, what is the biggest impact on a dynasty? Is it like the front office? Is it the coaching? Is it the players? Is it the fans? Like what is it that really makes a dynasty, right? So that's my kind of like concepts that I was thinking about. But as far as some of the things that you're talking about, let's start with the past. Let's start talking about like this whole Jordan Bulls thing, right? Since this is fairly relevant to topics that have been going on in recent media for the past couple of weeks or so.
So, all right, we can start there. So I did a little bit of research about the Bulls. I looked up like 4 or 5 teams that I would consider to be dynasties and that generally get recognized as dynasties, and then try to see how they got to where they were.
Okay.
And I think it would be good to kind of come to a consensus on what makes a dynasty, because that you brought it up. That's a tough one, because as I was doing the research on what teams are dynasties, I started to think, maybe that's not a dynasty. That don't really sound like right. It's really tough because you put it at such high esteem. It's hard to just say any team can fit that category. But I'll go to the Bulls real quick. So the Bulls joined the NBA in 1966, and they actually had the best record by an expansion team ever up to that point. And I'm not sure if that still holds or not, but at the very least, it was still the best record by winning 33 games and losing 48. And they made the playoffs in their inaugural season. So that's really good. So they didn't start off being terrible. It's not bad. They got a new GM later. They drafted well, And they actually had 4 straight 50-win seasons from 1970 to 1973. And they had 57 wins in 1972. They actually made the conference finals in 1974 and 75, but they lost both of those conference finals. So they almost made the NBA finals in the 70s, not even 10 years after they joined the league. So not bad, not a bad team, but they actually they started losing shortly thereafter. In 1979, they lost a coin flip for the rights to the first pick in the NBA draft, which was Magic Johnson.
Oh,
so if they'd have won the coin flip, they would have had Magic Johnson instead of the Lakers, and of course, NBA history would have completely changed, which is crazy, right? And later on, they had a couple of good players. They built their team around Artis Gilmore and Reggie Theus, but the results weren't that great in the late 70s, early 80s. So they started trading off their best players before the 1984 season. So they gotten rid of Reggie Theus, I think, shortly before they drafted Jordan.
Year before or so, something like that.
Yeah. So they drafted Jordan in 84, and Jerry Reinsdorf bought the team in 85 and decided to build the team around Jordan. And they have, they got Paxson in 85, Horace Grant and Pippen. They got those 2 players in 87. Phil Jackson started coaching in 89, and the rest is history, right?
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about how do we make dynasties, I think you have to have a vision all the way from the top that says, I want to win, right? Your ownership has to be on board with winning. It can't just be I want to make a profit. It can't just be, I want to be entertaining. You have to want to win. And he charges then his general manager, team president, whoever's making those moves, he charges those people with acquiring the best talent, right? That's another thing. And I think that talent is also coaching talent as well as playing talent, right? So you have to have a coach who knows the game well enough to put his players in position to win. And you also need players who can actually win. So I think it all comes from the top, and you have to be mindful of the vision from the top, get a coach who can actually achieve that vision, and players who fit in a system. System is so important. I think system is more important than anything.
Yeah.
Get a system, get people that fit in that system. And that's what I feel, because when the Bulls started winning, it was because they had Phil Jackson. But as we saw in the documentary, Phil Jackson said, hey, let's run this triangle offense. And that was a vision for how they wanted their offense to run. They had perfect players that fit. The Bulls were like basically what Golden State is now in terms of length, right? Golden State is all about length. Golden State claims to be miles ahead of every other team now because they draft players and they evaluate players based on length. Draymond Green is 6'6" with a 7-some wingspan, right? He can play that position because he's a small ball guy. The Bulls had length at so many positions, and that helped them because they were so good defensively. But you had that vision of the triangle offense where interchangeable parts, just rabid defense, right? Guy like Scottie Pippen, who can run the team and could be the point guard at 6'7". Jordan, of course, who could also do that and could lead the league in assists if he wanted to. And you got even guys like in their later run, Tony Kukoc, who was 6'10", but wasn't that kind of he wasn't a dominant inside guy because he had a skill set like a modern day wingman, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like their system fit their players so well because they basically had that same type of a team that a modern team has now with all the length and athleticism. Basically had these like taller guys though that can do things that their shorter counterparts could do.
I think that one of the things that you said was really critical, right? Is that it has to be – actually, let me back up. So one of the things that you said was that teams have to have the desire to win, right? Like that needs to be number one, right? And that needs to be throughout the whole organization. If you don't have that central part, then it's just going to be hard, right? Because you're not going to have the backing of personnel moves, all this other stuff. You're not going to want to spend on certain types of free agents. You're not going to listen to the coaching, right? You have to have that mindset from the top to the bottom. I think that's just super important, right? The next thing is being able to like have a sense to build that winning culture as a team, right? We've seen this in a lot of different types of sports teams, right? Building a winning culture around your football team or like finding your football team's identity. we're talking about the Bulls. I'll step away for a second just to talk about two comparisons of two teams. One is a clear-cut dynasty, right? And the other one is kind of like, man, they could have been so much more, right? But they weren't. And two teams I'm talking about are the Patriots and the Colts, right? You're probably going to hear like a lot of Colts references from me just because I'm a huge Colts fan and I'm from Indianapolis. So what you notice with those two teams and what used to annoy me was that both of them had a really good idea of their culture, right? The Colts offense was going to be one that's going to be like high scoring, right? The Colts defense was going to be like one of those non-type of breaking type offenses, right? They were going to let their quarterback lead them. They had really good wide receivers, really solid running backs, and typically a decent to okay line, right? Some really good pieces and not some others, right? The Patriots, however, they were just trying to win. Everything they did said win, right? And one of the things that bothered me the most was that the Colts, they would go up, they have these huge leads on other teams, and then they would take their foot off the gas. Whether it was the second half, whether it was the fourth quarter, they take their wheel off the gas, or their foot off the gas, and they end up losing some of those games. However, the Patriots at the same time were like, you know what? We're putting our foot on the gas and we're keeping it on the gas. And actually, we're going to press it a little bit harder. And because of that, they were better at finishing games than the Colts were. And that's one of the reasons why the Colts never ended up being that dominant franchise. Even though they had various winning seasons, have a Hall of Fame quarterback, Hall of Fame wide receivers, Hall of Fame running backs, they couldn't get there because of that specific thing. So I feel like you have to have that identity, but you also have to make sure that that winning at all costs type thing is there. Keep the gas on, don't take it off, because then it gets you into a mindset of, you know what, we can take the gas off right now because we won this. Let's be nice. Nah, you don't need to be nice. Forget that. Be like the Patriots, win this Super Bowl. I hated the Patriots, still do. Still hate the Patriots. So,
I don't have any skin in the game. I don't have any team that I root for in the NFL, but I do not root for the Patriots, definitely. But yeah. I like underdog teams. I rooted for the Bulls. I rooted for the Bills every Super Bowl they were in. So I'm just like that. I inherently knew, even as a child, who was not good, and I rooted for them.
Like, what did you
The Bills are interesting. I think the Bills are interesting, though, and I shouldn't say they weren't good, because clearly 4 straight Super Bowl trips means you're a great team, right? So what's the difference? Exactly. So how do you define a dynasty? Because if it's competing every year for a certain amount of time, then the Bills have a case, right? Because they did win championships, right? They won conference championships 4 in a row, which only one other team had done, right? Mm-hmm. So that, I think, qualifies them for some sort of consideration, but not winning the big championship somehow takes them out of consideration for being any sort of dynasty. It's just amazing. So I think a lot of this dynasty talk ends up being kind of in hindsight, and you can ascribe that title dynasty to a team after the fact, because when it happens, you just don't know. Another one, let's go away from the Bills, because it's kind of hard to define that, but we have to say that they're not, because they didn't win the championship, and no one would agree with us that they're a dynasty, right? So let's just go away from that. How about the Spurs?
I do want to talk to me about the Bills, though, because that's an interesting point, right? Like, that's one of the things I came to. If you come close, even if you're good, it doesn't matter. Like, if you think about like Alexander the Great, or like think about some of these dynasties, right? You can't say that I'm great when you like take losses at the most pivotal point, right? Like,
right.
You were good, Alexander the Good, maybe, but not Alexander the Great, right? And I feel like that's what the Bills were. They were Alexander the Good, but not Alexander the Great. So I just thought that was kind of like an interesting thing to put out there. If you're not getting it done at the highest level, no matter how good your team is, you are not considered a dynasty.
But if you think about it, before the merger, if they were just AFL, NFL, they would have had 4 straight AFL championships, right? And then you would look at that team completely different, because they won the highest game that they could win. And why they weren't winning the Super Bowls, I'd have to look more into that. I mean, they had a couple close calls. At least the first one was close, and I think the other ones might not have been as close. But to get there, they were dominating the AFC, right? Like, their offense was just hard to deal with. But for some reason, those NFC teams could figure out how to beat them.
They were the Alexander the Great team of the NFL.
They were.
They were, man. It's it's just hard. Like, 'cause all those ifs, right? And I think that that's the thing that's separating some of these dynasties, right? With these dynasties, you don't have to worry about those ifs, right? Like, if this catch would have happened, if they would have drafted this person, if blah, 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 right? Like, you don't have to worry about those with the great dynasties because they found a way to get it done. And I think that that is one of those characteristics that can't be looked past. Like, great dynasties get things done against all odds.
Right. And I think, again, I think that's because of the hindsight bias. It's hard to appreciate a team that almost did it. But if you were there at the time, you would appreciate how good they were. And now we summarize everything with one or two words. Buffalo Bills, not quite, right? Like, you can just summarize these things. But when you were there, and if you're someone on those teams, you knew what it was. They knew how good they were. But again, I want to ask you about San Antonio Spurs, because that's a team that when I was thinking about it, I was like, I don't know where to put them on the list if you're talking about dynasties. What do you think about San Antonio Spurs?
I think that the San Antonio Spurs, I would consider them a dynasty, right? And I feel like one of the things, like, if you think about dynasty, right, like, dynasty is also kind of like a family or a clan type thing, right? Like, and I feel that the Spurs always had this family. They always had a way that they were going about things. They always had a certain type of understanding of who they were. A lot of times I didn't see them playing too many other people's type of game. They stuck to what they did really well, got the pieces that they needed in there, and they rose from there, right? Like, I'm not sure how it was at that time, but I don't think, or I can't remember a team that had so many international players that were on the same team that were all that good, right? Like, Manu Ginobili is probably my favorite player of all time, right? Like, I love Kobe, I love LeBron, right? But Manu just had the swag to him, just like, whatever, I'm gonna do whatever, and just like do the craziest things. People just gonna be like, how? Like, how?
Irrational confidence. He's got it. You just need it.
I love Manu, man. Manu is the dude. You know what I mean? But yeah, I feel like they just had a specific type of thing that they kind of like followed that worked with them, and it just kind of stuck, right? And I know there was a crazy stuff about like them and like the culture there outside of the team that everybody else saw. But as far as a fan or onlooker's point of view, from just seeing the Spurs from a distance, I definitely would consider them a dynasty. And I felt like I had a good view of what they were doing and how it was beneficial for them to win titles.
So for me, I said no on that. And the reason why I said no was just the way you equated a dynasty to a family, right? If I have a dynasty, let's say the Lakers of the early 2000s, they won 3 in a row. If I had my king on the throne for three consecutive, whatever, three kings on the throne, at least I can say that's a short dynasty, but it's a dynasty. If I have a king on the throne that then gets deposed and then he wins and then he gets deposed and then he wins, I don't know what that means. I don't feel like that's necessarily a dynasty if my lineage keeps getting knocked off the throne and the Spurs winning every other year at some point, taking a break, winning, win 99, won in 2003, 05, and 07, and then won in 2014. All those that every other year stuff means they're a very good team that could always compete, but they had years where they just went away or years where they were beaten. Now, there was tough competition out in the West at that time. And, the Lakers earned what they got, and the other teams that, Dallas, they earned what they got. But if you can't hold the throne for more than a year, they didn't repeat ever. Like, that to me says something. And everything that we talked about for a dynasty is there for them, except to me, the consistent winning. And they won, but if you can't win 2 years in a row, I feel like that says something about, I'm not sure if it's the motivation, I'm not sure what it is, but that's what made me hesitate with the Spurs. I think the Spurs were a great team. They still are. They still have a great vision. Everything that we defined is there. But to me, the winning wasn't consistent enough.
Well, if you say that, right, like with the Spurs, with their championships, they won 2003, 2005, 2006. So over a 4-year span, they only lost one championship in that time.
Oh three, oh five, oh seven.
Huh?
03, 05, 07.
03, 05, 06.
Right?
Right?
07. The Heat won in 06.
Oh, okay, cool. Right. So basically, in a 5-year period, they won 3 championships. I feel like that's still a pretty strong number. Like thinking about just the NBA and just like how hard it is to win championships. And I feel like this is why I consider them a dynasty, because they were consistently good, and then they also had very great moments in that time frame. Like if it would have been something where they won like maybe like 2 out of like 5 years, it's kind of like, okay, well they're kind of good. I think 3 and then still being in contention and then having other championships that were not necessarily right there but close still is a valuable thing. But I do understand your point, right? It wasn't like they won like back-to-back. They were never back-to-back champions. And that does take a toll, right? But I feel like how many teams have had back-to-back championships since they've won their first one in 99, I wonder?
I mean, let's see, the Lakers might have been the only one, and then the Heat. That's what I would say. Because Detroit made it back-to-back years, and they lost that second year to the Spurs. And the Spurs never even made the finals back-to-back years is the thing, too. It wasn't like they lost. They had never lost the finals until they lost to the Heat. So they weren't, they won when they got there, but they weren't making it even consecutive years.
Yeah, let's see.
The Lakers had two different trips of winning consecutive championships, right? And then the Heat, and I think that might be it.
Yeah, so I think let me see, what was it? So you had San Antonio, right? Then you had the Lakers. Then you had San Antonio again.
Then Detroit
Pistons, San Antonio. So was that like switched in there?
Yeah.
And then, what was it? Miami, San Antonio, then Boston, Lakers, Dallas. Then the Heat won it twice, so they won it back to back. Another San Antonio, Golden State won it back to back. Yeah, I think it's hard, man. I think that San Antonio's did make the back to back playoffs too with 2013, 2014.
Yeah, that was the first time they'd done it.
Yeah, that was the one with the Miami Heat. But I feel like that's another thing to think about, right? Like when we're talking about dynasties and kind of like relating them to families and like long term, right? San Antonio was good with players when they were young and when they were old. They were able to find people that fit in their system, right? Every dynasty is going to end up losing players or losing warriors in a sense over time. But how do you replenish those? And how do you replenish those in the same form of your style, I guess, to be successful? I think that those long-term dynasties are the ones that are more impressive, right? Like if the Lakers just won a three-peat at one point in time, right, we would say, okay, you know what? The Lakers from this year to this year were a dynasty, right? If the Celtics only won from or the Heat, right? So the Heat from this year to this year were kind of like a dynasty, right? But if you think about teams like long-term that you think about as like dynasty-type teams, like during the Greg Popovich tenure, then I would say like the Spurs, right? Or the Lakers, they just have like a dynasty, right? Because they have like this lineage that's just solid throughout. So I think that the point you're making is like good. But it's hard for me to take the Spurs out of the running, and maybe that's because I just lived through the Spurs being so dominant that I
right. And the thing about the Spurs, or the thing about the Spurs to me was, I don't feel like the Spurs ever scared you. If you were a fan of another competitor, I don't feel like the Spurs scared you. I think the Spurs challenged you, but I think what the Spurs had was the system, and they kind of had, they would do what it took. They had some questionable players, like you're saying, maybe Bruce Bowen, you're worried that he would take out your best player. And they had, certain things like that. But I don't think that they had that top-end talent except for Tim Duncan, right? That you knew Tim Duncan was going to be one of the best players in the league. And the amalgamation of all the other players, Parker was great. You couldn't stop Parker. He could get in the lane whenever he wanted. Ginobili, great passer, great shooter. He was a complete player too. But I feel like if you had a top player, you could figure out how to compete with the Spurs. And I don't think that they scared you in the same way that the Lakers did when the Lakers were good in the early 2000s.
And I think
right?
Good point, right? They didn't scare you because they didn't have that dominant player that was just going to like knock you out, right? It wasn't like a Jordan or like a Kobe type thing. But you know what else that means though is that when you get beat by a team that doesn't seem like they should be as dominant as they are to you, then it makes you mad because you're like, we should have beat them, you know what I mean? And then it just frustrates you. And then it gets into the mind part, right? They start to play a mind game with you. Like, it's so close. Like, how does Tim Duncan do this turnaround, like, post shot, right? And make it. Like, that shouldn't be happening. You know what I mean? It just edges you. And I feel like that's one thing that dynasties have, too. It's like, you know that they're going to, like, make people mad and angry just because they win, right?
Right. And so I think going back, I think what you're saying speaks a lot to the coaching and to why people consider Popovich one of the greatest coaches in NBA history. Because he doesn't have the ring count of Red Auerbach, Phil Jackson, and he's somewhere around where Pat Riley is, right? So that he doesn't necessarily have the ring count as some of the other ones who are considered the greatest, but because of what he did in the market that San Antonio was in, which you're not getting the free agents, right? And that's another thing, that a dynasty has to get players, and they have to do it somehow. A lot of them can do it. LA can always get players because of its location, right? Even New York could become more of a dynasty because of its location, but San Antonio couldn't. So considering the constraints that they had, I think that what happened with them and their winning was attributed a lot to Popovich's acumen as the coach, right? And you're right that his mantra was to win also, because one of his first acts as coach, well, as GM, he fired the coach or whatever, right, and stepped down and took the position of coach for himself, right? So that was one of his first changes that he made. Then he made sure that the team did what they could to get Tim Duncan, right? He was the cornerstone piece. So they drafted well there. They already had David Robinson, who was one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history, and he was actually still pretty good, getting toward the end of his career at that time. But they built around Tim Duncan, and they knew it. So all the things that we're saying are there, right? Everything is there. But maybe it was the top-end talent that wasn't the same as for some of these other teams as why they didn't win back-to-back. I'm not sure. But I think that they're a great team, and this one definitely we have to agree to disagree on it. And I think that's, it happens sometimes, right? But
I mean,
we can
I think
another game.
What you added was just an interesting point, though, right? We're talking about creating a dynasty in a small market compared to creating a dynasty in a big market. And should one be more significant than the other, right? Like, if you're able to create a dynasty in a small market, right, or get close to it, is that as impressive as creating a dynasty in a big market? And I feel like in today's game, it is a little bit, but in the older game, right, like, you didn't have a lot of people changing teams. You didn't have free agents going all over the place. So even a long time ago, right, even in those Duncan times, right, like, you didn't have these big free agents that were just like switching teams initially, right? But nowadays it's totally different. So back then, creating a dynasty, a little bit different than how it would be today. But I think that one of the things with today, like kind of going towards another topic that's similarly related, or that's related, is that, say, for example, it's not necessarily just the players. It's not necessarily just the mindset to win, but it's also about having the vision, right? And this is coming into the team aspect. What team are you building? Say, for example, in what year was that? 2007? No, 2000. Yeah, maybe 2007, 2008, something like that. Whenever Paul George came into the league, right? So Pacers drafted Paul George. Next year comes around, they're in I think like the 13th spot or something like that. And there's this guy that drops to him, and he drops, and I'm like, yes, like, I wanted to trade up to get this guy. He fell to us, and then we drafted him. And I was like, yes. I was like, having him paired next to Paul George is going to be sick. Like a 2-3 combination with those two, right? I was like, this is like a dream defensive scenario. And then I found out that they traded the pick away. And who they traded to? The Spurs. So this trade was George Hill plus our second-round pick to the Spurs. Or sorry, our first-round pick and our second-round pick to the Spurs for George Hill. And when I saw this, like, I'm a huge George Hill fan. Went to high school in the same conference as George Hill, like, been around this dude before or whatever. He's cool, really cool dude. But I was like, man, like, I love his game, but you have to see that pairing Paul George with Kawhi Leonard is like a dream scenario. And the Pacers didn't see that. And I feel like one reason why was because Larry Bird was so fascinated with the idea of having George Hill that he didn't see what could have came if he would have had Kawhi and Paul George, especially from being in a small market, and then especially with thinking about superstars wanting to play with other superstars and them there long term. Like that would have been tremendous for the Pacers, right? And what happened? The Spurs saw that, they realized the opportunity, took advantage of it, and the story goes on from there, right? So,
yeah, I think that's a little tough to blame Larry Bird for that, because back when Kawhi Leonard was coming out of college, I don't think people knew he was going to be what he became, right? And a lot of what he became was development through the San Antonio Spurs system. Spurs were one of the first teams, right, hit that corner three. They really had that offense that was geared toward shooters. And what Kawhi Leonard could do back then, I think he was kind of a big guy in college, right? He played a lot around the basket. Like, I think that what he was doing there, maybe he didn't fit quite as well. Like, if you already had Paul George, would you need Kawhi Leonard? Or do you need someone to distribute the ball over? Because Paul George was going to be their team at that point. Like, didn't they have Danny Granger at the time too? It felt kind of weird that they had both of them guys.
I can't remember if they might have had Granger. I can't remember if they had Granger or not.
Because I feel like they were kind of redundant for a little bit until they got rid of Granger.
And that's the thing, right? Like, I feel like even if they could have did that, right? Like, they still could have had a team where, when you're talking about length and how the Spurs work with, the Warriors work with length, right? You could have had Paul George playing the three, or if you wanted to, you could have had Kawhi playing the four, or switch them in and out depending on how the matchup was, and then had Danny Granger. That is a long team, right? From that 2 to 4 position, that's huge. And then you also have Roy Hibbert on the back end. That's going to be this like cornerstone. What do you got to do? You're going to have these lockdown defenders on the outside. You get by them, drive in just to see Roy Hibbert. Who wants to deal with that, right?
Yeah. Roy Hibbert had a short shelf life, didn't he? Roy Hibbert went from being the most dominant big man to being like insignificant almost. Almost you couldn't use him in such a short time.
He kind of, not him just in general, right? But good players, you can kind of tell when players are really good because they can force teams in the future to change around their system. And if those players are still relevant, then it's like they're a really good player, right? Roy Hibbert, he was a really good player at one point in time in a certain system, and then teams just figured out how to like negate him, right? And it's just kind
small
of
ball, Small ball. All right, small ball happened that ball, next year, pretty much. Like when he started doing it, that was like it, But let's say, I mean, that one's also questionable to me, the whole thing. I just think that you do have to have the conviction when you draft your players. And that's another thing we didn't really say. Player development is huge. I don't think the Pacers could have developed Kawhi Leonard the same way that the Spurs did. Because when you have your system in place, you need a guy to fulfill a role. Then that's it. You don't ask him to do too much. You don't put too much weight on him, right? When he's a rookie, you don't ask him to be the guy in your team. And I think that helps them come along a little bit. So Kawhi, they ask Kawhi to do a certain thing. You know, they ask Kawhi to work on his jump shot. They ask Kawhi to work on his offense a little bit and just play defense, which he was already naturally more inclined to be good at.
I think they did the same thing. I feel like that would have been that same route. Because if you think about Paul George, right? Paul George came from Fresno. He was typically more of a big guy, right? And then I was excited for him to be picked too. Like, I was so excited when he fell to us. Like, those are the 2 picks I wanted. And I saw Paul George in the offseason, and he was just dominating his competition. Just straight dominating them. One-on-ones, like, he was just dominating them, right? And he was a lot more impressive in those times than he was in college. With Kawhi, this is when I was really into like the off-season part and like the draft. I still am, but with Kawhi, I saw him working on his 3 over the summer, and that was like his biggest thing, right? It's like defensive, really, really strong, like solid with the ball in his hands, can pass, but his shot was questionable.
Yep.
And I could tell by his work ethic, and I could tell by how smooth his 3-point got, he was going to be able to develop it. And like, I feel like Paul George developed his game. He developed his three. He developed his consistency. I feel like Kawhi could have did that same thing. Maybe he wouldn't have turned out to be as good as he is just because every situation is dependent, but maybe he would have ended up turning out to be even better. Who knows necessarily, right? I feel like he's a player with a lot of drive and a natural leader. He's kind of quiet and whatever, but
on the court, he's a leader, definitely.
It's kind of interesting. I do want to like take this concept, but just talk about one more thing related to it. And what you're talking about is player development in drafting, right? And I feel like that's a huge thing. And one of the examples that I want to look at was the Cleveland Cavaliers, right? And their approach to try to get a dynasty, right? I was looking at, let me see, what is this? Oh, the Cavaliers, right? They had some really bad drafting years before they got to LeBron, right? The year before, they like drafted like DeJuan Wagner. Like, I don't know if you remember DeJuan Wagner. I believe he played for Memphis. He was solid, but he didn't scream out like, I'm going to be the best, right? They could have taken Amari Stoudemire in that year, right? Like, and then like the year before that, they drafted Diop or something like that, which again is like, no, right? And then the year before that, they drafted Chris Milne, right? So it's like from Texas. And it's just like these guys they drafted really bad. And eventually they were able to get a player that was so dynamic in LeBron James that he changed around the whole entire like draft, right? And when you're talking about like the opportunities, well, when they drafted Chris Milne in 2000, right? Just reading off some of the names that were in that draft. You had Elton Brand, Steve Francis, Baron Davis, Lamar Odom, Jonathan Bender, Wally Zerbiak. Like all these guys are pretty much all-stars at some point, right? Well, Bender had his injuries, but he also set the record for McDonald's All-American. Like he was a good guy, right? And then he had Richard Hamilton. And then I think that year they took Archie Miller, right? But again, there's so many other players that were around that they could have taken.
I think that is a little bit of flawed logic. I think this is a trap that a lot of us fall into, looking back in hindsight and saying we could have taken XYZ player. The problem is you got to have fit. You got to have who you want, if you don't evaluate the talent right, that's one thing. But if I look at this 2000 draft, I'm not blown away by the people. Is Mike Miller, Jamal Crawford? I mean, Kenyon Martin went number one. Kenyon Martin was a great college player, but
did he turn out to be? Might have been the one that was at 99 or something, maybe with Elton Brand, Steve Francis.
Right. I think my point still stands in that.
Your point is not about that. It's about the dynasty and talking about how you're developing a dynasty.
Right.
They wanted to develop it. If you're trying to do it through the draft, right? They didn't necessarily have the best draft picks, but they fell into LeBron. And then after they fell into LeBron, right, they had somebody they could try to build a dynasty around.
Right. And then I think that's more
one of the interesting things, right? Like,
yeah,
until that point in time, like, they weren't necessarily a really solid team. They didn't necessarily know exactly where they wanted to go. They didn't necessarily have an identity. They were trying to find it out. And then when LeBron came, it kind of gave that whole franchise an identity of where they wanted to go. It didn't necessarily work out because they still were a questionable team as far as like their front office, but they did try to like put the team together to build a dynasty around LeBron James.
Right. And that's the thing. I think that's really what matters, because once you get the person you want to build around, then you work to that person's skills, right? You work to that person's skill set. And the draft is like a lottery, right? The draft is just a bunch of lottery tickets that you try to maximize the number of lottery tickets you get. If you can pick number one for 10 straight years, you're going to get one person out of those 10 years, at the very least, who's going to be able to carry a team and you can build the team around. If you miss on those other 9, it's okay. You can't look at those other 9 and regret what you've missed, because it's the lottery. Nobody ever regrets not winning the lottery.
I'm not just talking about like them like making the picks and then going from this way. I'm talking about like the picks that you get, right? Especially when you're a small market team, you have to have some type of like development or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if you're trying to build a franchise, right, you need to be able to hit consistently on certain types of picks.
But you can't. It's just not possible. That's the thing.
It's not that it's not possible. It's not that it's not possible, right? But even when it's not possible, you have to pick pieces that work well with what you're trying to do, right? Say, for example, the Warriors. The Warriors, I think either it was back-to-back years or there might have been like 1 year skipped. They got players that fit what they were trying to do.
This is perfect because this is where I wanted to go next anyway.
They had a coach that was really good with point guards. I think it was
Mark Jackson?
Yeah, Jackson, right? So they were like, all right, we're going to develop this, right? So they got Curry, right? They knew that he could shoot, right? And now they said, okay, cool. This guy can shoot. All right. He plays really quick. What else can we put around him? They were able to get Klay Thompson, right? Another shooter, another long guy, right? They were able to develop him and let him fit into his specific mode, right? You shoot these jumpers, you be out here like, now we're going to have this two-prong attack. Then they go out the year after Klay and they get Draymond Green, right? Draymond slipped super far in that draft. I think he's only one or two players like in the first round or so to actually in that draft to make an all-star game, right? But they saw a vision of what they wanted and how that person could help them out. They were going to be a quick team that could shoot threes, that could pass the ball, and they were going to be long. And then they had this solid core all from the draft, and they developed those players around the draft and then added other players around them as well. And this is what I'm talking about. You have to be able to hit during the draft. Of course, you're not going to be able to hit everybody, right? But it's kind of like, what are you looking for, right? You have to start somewhere. You have to get those impact players. And I feel like that's the thing. You see players with a lot of upside when you're around the 13th pick or the 12th pick. Well, you know what? Like, you're probably going to need one of those players that you can to develop around, right? Unless your team already has a superstar that's going to stay around for a long time. But being in a small market, you don't know how long your superstar is going to stay around, especially in today's NBA. So that takes me to the point where when you could have got Kawhi Leonard, who had potential to be one of the best players in the NBA, compared to trading that for George Hill, which he wasn't going to be one of the best players in the NBA. He would be a solid player. Like, you take that chance on the best player when you were a small market team with no questions asked. And that's the difference that I think. So I don't know. I think the Warriors did really well with how they decided to build their team and put it together. But that's just my take on the Warriors. What were you thinking about with the Warriors?
Warriors, I think, are an interesting case. First of all, I actually did have a hard time deciding if the Warriors were a dynasty too, because of the kind of the short nature of what they've done so far. But looking back, I'm more convinced because of how well they've done in this short period. They made 5 straight finals, right? But the thing that made the Warriors go, they got new ownership. And that new ownership, let me see, I got it in my notes here. The new ownership, I think, was 2014.
Okay.
2010. Sorry, it was 2010 where they got new ownership. And at that point, things started to change because I think they had a bigger group of owners, and they drafted Curry in 2009. But they got Mark Jackson as the coach in 2011, and that was the same year they drafted Klay Thompson. And the way that they played then was not the same that they played after Steve Kerr came. So after 3 years of being pretty good and winning and increasing their win total every year under Mark Jackson, there was some internal strife that caused them to get rid of Mark Jackson, right?
Yeah.
So that's leadership from the top saying we need to make a change in order to make our organization better. They hired Steve Kerr, who hadn't been a coach before, but Steve Kerr got along with the ownership. They liked him. They knew him from previous, from years ago, so they already had relationships. And what he did was took a team that was actually one of the better defensive teams because that was their identity, and he infused a better offensive philosophy. So I see what you're saying in terms of the drafting, but their drafting, interestingly enough, they got good players that weren't actually utilized properly, let's say, in the system that they were in when they got drafted, but they got molded. Draymond Green wasn't like the main guy until Steve Kerr came in to do their small ball thing, right? Because like David
wasn't there yet either, right?
Yeah. I'm saying, but he wasn't like they didn't do that small ball that made Draymond Green so valuable.
Yeah.
Until Steve Kerr. So I think when you have that, like that move, the reason why the Warriors are what they are right now, I think, is directly because of their ownership and their vision the ownership had that had been building, but they finally figured out what the key was, what the difference was. And they found the coach that then instilled the philosophy. And Steve Kerr's philosophies come from all of his previous playing in some of the triangle from Phil Jackson, some of kind of the pace and space from San Antonio, and then even up tempo from Mike D'Antoni, right, and Phoenix. So he kind of put it all together. They started leading the league in tempo, whereas before they were one of the best defensive teams. Their offensive efficiency shot them up to like number one or two in Steve Kerr's first year, and they were only just better and better because they took that defense that was actually instilled by Mark Jackson, which I think is interesting, and then ended up becoming what they were based on the offense that Steve Kerr helped build. And Steve Kerr he's always made the finals as the coach, right? He never missed the finals as a coach. So that's why I say, all right, the run that they had is dynasty-like, because even though they lost 2 finals during this run, they never missed out on the finals. This year will be the first year, and Steve Kerr is probably hoping they don't play the rest of the season so that they don't have a finals for him to miss. Right? But I think that it's interesting because of how they built the team, and what their final missing piece was actually their coach that took them over the top to utilize the pieces that were there.
Yeah.
Because I don't think any other coach would have taken Steph Curry and said, shoot the most threes in NBA history.
And I think that was one
number
of the
2,
issues, right? Is
right
when Jackson was there, right? Like he was too focused on controlling in the defensive aspects of the team, right? And they needed somebody that was going to say, you know what? We have these awesome offensive players. Let's develop around these guys and like have them do what they do best and like shoot and create. And I think when we're talking about those same type of players, right? When Steph came out of college, he was one of those players that is similar to Kawhi Leonard in a sense. They had like a lot of production at their university, but it always seemed like they were like missing like one thing because it was like a mid-major or whatever, or not necessarily the highest level of colleges, right? And he was a shooter. He was a shot creator. He didn't necessarily have the defense, right? He wasn't necessarily the fastest player at that point. Like his ball handling was like, okay, but he had a relevant skill, but people didn't know how relevant it was going to be. They didn't know how relevant his long distance shooting could be in the NBA, right? And how it could affect how players are going to be going forward, right? But they took somebody that was special, a rare type of player, and they developed him, right? And I think that thing about like being a rare type of player with an ability to be able to come in and use that skill right away is huge. And I feel like that's why those 3-and-D guys are so good, right? Because they're a rare type of player that can be used no matter what.
Yeah, and Curry took a while to develop because of the injury problems. Mm-hmm. And he didn't make his first All-Star game until 2013 or something like that.
Probably.
Like maybe in his 4th or 5th year. So he took him a while to develop because I think what he does is just not what people were used to doing. Mm-hmm. And really, if you look at his 3-point attempts by year, there's just like they go up gradually. But then I think 2015, the number of 3-point attempts that he and Clay both shot just skyrockets. That's actually the second year into their run where they won 73 games.
Yeah, where Curry like shoot, just
they were just
got to shoot
like 11 threes per game or something like that. And then James Harden, I think, has since passed that in terms of threes per game. But what they do is revolutionary in that you have a coach that's like, let it fly. I was watching some old like highlights, and that's kind of what he would say in the locker room, let it fly. Exactly. And he empowered them to do that. But that's a prime example of building around the skills of your best player. No other coach, I don't think, would have done that. Mark Jackson didn't do that. He didn't want to just take, 33 attempts a game? No coach would do that. Even San Antonio, they want to shoot efficient threes. They don't want to shoot any three, right? Yeah. So I think the pace and space and there's just that change of small ball. I mean, they even encourage Draymond Green, right? He's shooting threes.
It's funny that you say that, right? Like, that's a whole crazy concept that you just added in there, right? Like the Spurs were all about taking efficient shots and efficient threes. What the Warriors did, in a sense, was take these people and say, you know what? We're going to make pull-up threes actually become efficient threes, right? Like they made something that wasn't necessarily considered efficient, overly efficient. And then they made it so efficient that other teams were like, we have to start developing this, right? And I feel like that's one of the aspects that really is interesting with the NBA when you have something that becomes overly efficient right? It's a copycat league, and you start to get people there, or you start to get people doing that, right? So I think the Warriors are a special case, right? They had a lot of things fall into place with them, a lot of guys that ended up fitting the system that they ended up going to, right? But it's good to have players that like play off of each other. And then also like injuries are going to be one thing that's always a big thing. But I definitely think that it's just the whole overall top to bottom type philosophy. And it does take time to build it up. But I think that hitting early with draft picks, or hitting not necessarily early, but hitting with draft picks that have high potential closely together allows a team, especially a small market team, to really stand up and start that improvement, because it's hard to get guys signed when you're a small market team like that. Also, when you have a lot of like young guys in, you have even if it's a big market team, young guys in that are like really good. Now you have a lot of capital that you can use to invest in players to put around them, because you know that their contracts are fairly cheap. So I do feel like the drafting part is a huge thing that goes along with that, and especially like hitting on those draft picks. Sometimes you're just going to get these revolutionary players, but other times it's going to be hard. And even sometimes revolutionary players can get you there, right? KD and Westbrook, right? Like they weren't able to get there, right? For whatever reasons.
Yeah. There's a lot of reasons, I'm sure, for that. I think if they had been in a different coaching system that would have delineated who did what, that probably would have helped them out, because the talent they had on that team probably should have been a mini dynasty as well. They should have won at least one championship if Harden was actually allowed to play. Because how does he go from being the bench guy to just being the guy in Houston the very next season, right?
The guy, like it's a shame to say like that team didn't do more than what they did. Having like Westbrook was probably one of the most dynamic players to ever play the game.
Yeah, definitely.
KD, like one of the best, like just like pure scorers that's out there. And then having like Harden, who is just, man, he's just an offensive threat, like through and through, like 3-point, driving in, passing. It's crazy to see how much they had that they weren't able to get it done.
Yeah, and I like what Jalen Rose says a lot. He says how people can be unlocked, and I like that term, because I think that's kind of what happened with Harden. That's what happened with Steph and Clay. Mm-hmm. Their abilities were unlocked, right? Yeah. They had that potential all along, and you just have to have that right person come out and unlock that potential. And even KD, when he got with the Warriors, he got exactly what he wanted in a team, and that allowed him to play freer, and that allowed him to just dominate. Like KD in the finals, his whole career has just put up numbers, right? He's not played any worse in the final. A lot of people can say that played worse when the moment got big. I don't think KD ever did, especially on the final stage. And I think just being with the Warriors, it just ramped up his confidence, and it just made him into a different level player, I think, to where he was the best player on a stacked team already, or at least on a team that had reached its own like self-awareness and knew what it was on offense and achieved highly, right?
Yeah.
So I think you have to be able to utilize players and just give them what they need to just be successful. And that's super hard to do. I also think one thing that we didn't talk about, we mentioned free agents, but we never talked about kind of players that sacrifice to come. Looking at the Warriors specifically, Sean Livingston, Andre Iguodala, Maurice Spates, there's a lot of guys that came over, right, to be a part of it. They weren't starting. Iguodala was just the best player on a playoff team, right, with Philly, and he took a step back. And when you have guys like that, when your sixth man used to be an all-star, that's when you're going to be a good team. That's when there's less drop-off than other teams, right? So even when you have that, when people know you're going somewhere, right, they know that you can be good. They want to be a part of it. And like David West, how many years was David West taking discounts trying to win a championship, right? That man was like, wherever it was hot, he was there.
So I wanted to talk about one thing, but you just made me think about something, right? Like, and this, we can talk about this later. Would the Bulls have been able to be the Bulls that they were if Pippen didn't take the Pippen contract, right? Like, if he didn't have that contract, how would it affect them, right? Because you're talking about all these people now that are taking these lower contracts and allowing for really good players to be on the one team, right? That's kind of what the Bulls were able to do with Pippen, right? Like if he was making crazy amounts of money, would they have been able to invest? Would they have been as good, right? That's an interesting thing to think about with just like knowing their teams and like some of the players that they had there as well. So I don't know.
That's another factor is being able to pay everyone that needs to be paid and to have enough money for that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that was OKC's problem. They didn't know who to pay. They had to pick between Ibaka and Harden, right? And they chose Ibaka because that's what they thought was right. And again, a lot of these things happen. I know people love to second guess things. And I feel like that's, like I said, I think that's a trap that we get into, second guessing things. Because you're not going to get that opportunity again. If you do, you got to make a better decision, yes. But they made the best decision that they thought. And they didn't know that James Harden was going to turn into that. And maybe being traded motivated him to turn into what he turned into, right? You can never tell.
I feel like they had that decision, right? They had the decision to be like, you know what are we going to do, right? And this is the difference between like their situation and the Warriors, and what the Warriors did and what OKC did, right? OKC had a decision. Are we going to be like the rest of the NBA, have some scores and have some defense, right? Some rebounders, some people that can do this part, right? We need to have all of that. So let's let one of those scorers go, and we're just going to stay with this and try to compete as much as we want. Well, with the Warriors, they were just like, you know what? We're going to do something a little bit different. They already had like kind of like the defense, and like OKC did have some more defense as well, right? But the Warriors were like, we're going to just outshoot people, right? And OKC could have did that same type of mindset, right? They could have said, we're just going to outshoot people if they had the coaching, if they had the management. Let Russell Westbrook and Harden just work off of each other, or let Westbrook like driving, kick it out to Harden. Harden can kick it out to Durant, right? And just like let them play off of each other like naturally. They could have had like that same type of scorers, shooters type of team if they would have wanted to, but they chose to go a different direction. And we saw how that ended up turning out for them. They got close, but not right there. They got so close that Kevin Durant was like, you know what? I'm going to go to the team that just beat me.
Yeah, but I also think, though, right, you think about it, they could have actually done – Ibaka shoots threes now, right? Last year's finals, Ibaka was shooting threes, and he wasn't hesitating to shoot threes because that's where the NBA is now. Had that been the same thing, Ibaka would have shot threes back then, and he wouldn't have replaced Harden scoring, but it would have been a better exchange, right? Because
it depends on like I think the difference is just they saw that as a viable offense. The Warriors saw just shooting a bunch as a viable offense, right? With respect to how that's going to limit other things, and OKC didn't see that. Now, and I feel like also OKC was just kind of like, we don't think that we can spread the ball around with three people.
Yeah.
And Warriors were like, we do think that we can spread the ball around with three people, and we're going to do it, and we're going to show you it. And I think
that's just because their offense fit their pieces better. Yeah, and I do think, though, like the thing that people, I guess, underrate, too, about Golden State is not just the three-point shooting. It's the sabermetric approach. It's the take the best shot. It's layups, right? Sean Livingston doesn't shoot three-pointers, but he's always in the lane, right? He's always getting easy shots, right? So
yeah,
KD was the only one that was shooting mid-range, and he just shoots at such a high efficiency that it's okay. But they weren't shooting like, you know what I mean? They weren't trying to shoot mid-range. They were still doing that sabermetric approach.
But that's the thing, it opened up for them, right? It opened up for them because they spread the floor so much, right? And I feel like it comes back to that thing that you're talking about. Steve Kerr had a vision of how he could take these pieces that were on the team and mold them into something that was going to be special, that was going to be unique, that was going to have its own stamp. And when you think about the Warriors dynasty, right, you think about this three-point shooting, how they changed around the league, right? You don't think about the defense that they played with or the layup. Like, you think about those 3 points. And, like, if you're talking about OKC, right, like, what if Kerr would have went to OKC? That could have been a totally different type of situation, right? Because now he sees the strengths and weaknesses. Maybe he expands the court by having KD and Harden, like, utilizing their range and their scoring ability and just letting Westbrook just create for every single person that's out there. Like, there's so many possibilities. And like you say, like, it's hard to, like, judge the past and say how it would go. Like I said, I think that was interesting. how those two different teams kind of went about it. And I'm not sure what you had to say on that topic, but I did want to just throw in like one more thing that I thought would be kind of cool to look at before we get out of here. And we're always talking about the teams, or so far today we talked about the teams that had made dynasties, the teams that had these super strong dynasties. What about those teams that just can't get their dynasties started, right? Or the ones that couldn't, right? Like, say for example, like the Bucks with Giannis. It took a while for Giannis to get better, right? And now they're starting to try to build their dynasty. Like, what else will they need to build that dynasty, right? It was a while. Or talking about the Nets, right? The Nets had so many bad years, and now they're like trying to build that dynasty by taking a certain type of approach. Like, what do these teams need to go from where they are now to try to create some type of dynasty and then go forward from there?
I worry about the Bucks because you're already hearing whispers about Giannis leaving, and you already hear them being like, "Oh, Giannis to Golden State," right? So I worry about that because what makes the Bucks, I think, limited is Giannis actually, and it's not because he's not good, because he's going to win 2 straight MVP awards, right? He's a great player, but the weaknesses that he has, I think, can be exploited in the playoff, and that's what happened. I think if you play him a certain way, you maybe get more physical with him. Then they figured it out. And that's another thing, that when you have a dynasty, you have to have multiple options, right? Mm-hmm. Houston can't get out of their own way because James Harden, once he gets bottled up in the playoffs, for whatever reason, they weren't able to just overcome that. And maybe it was kind of a systemic kind of low self-esteem as compared to the Warriors or something. But something was there that when Harden got bottled up, they didn't function. And so I think Giannis, if he starts shooting threes better, because that's the only thing that would make people really play him differently, I think that would unlock their dynasty. Because I don't think that there's much that they can't do. I mean, if they're winning 60 games every year consistently, they figured out how to win games. But now they have to figure out how to win the important games. So I think that's what's limiting them. I think the Nets are just a mess from the top down. I feel like the whole issue with their ownership, and is do they still have the same owner? Do they get sold? I just think that the ownership is not where it needs to be. So a lot of the moves that they make, they're not really, they don't know where they're going with their moves, right? So,
yeah, I mean, that's one where it was like what you were talking about before, right? Their focus, or their owner, was more business focused initially, right? Like he was like an oil tycoon or something that like bought the team, right? But he was looking at it more of a financial type aspect, which if you have a strong team, right, then you should have a strong financial aspect, right? Because it's going to bring in fans, and that should be a driver as well.
And the revenue sharing with the NBA, right? You're going to make money, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it shouldn't even be that hard of a thing.
Yeah, I think just jumping onto that topic with Giannis, like Giannis, when we're talking about that same thing, right? With with Kawhi, with Steph, with Giannis, right? You had people that had very unique skill sets that not that many people in the NBA had. Were they going to be able to develop it? Well, they didn't need to develop it all the way, but they needed to develop other parts of their game. Giannis was an interesting one because, like, when he came in, he had so much potential, but it was just like all over the place, right? He didn't know how to develop it. You knew he was going to be long, right? His defense wasn't extraordinary, right, when he came into the league. But he did have a ton of potential. And I think that Milwaukee saw that. And, like, luckily, I don't even know how Giannis developed as well as he did. I'm not sure if you know how, but, like,
I can't tell you now.
He has really developed his game to his skill set. And they tried to add some pieces, right? They have some other people that are there. Chris Middleton's, like, pretty good. Did they draft? Yeah, they drafted Jabari Parker, right? And then he
but Jabari, I don't know, is he with the Bulls right now?
Yeah, I think Jabari, like, he had his injuries and couldn't get there, but what if, right? What if Jabari Parker was like the Parker that he was before he got hurt at Duke? You know what I mean?
If he was the college version of himself?
Yeah, like before the injuries, man, those injuries are pretty crazy, right? So, man, I think it's hard. I think the biggest thing to take away from from this whole conversation for me is that if you're trying to make a dynasty, if you're trying to be competitive, you really, really, really need to make sure that there's a clear plan for the team from the top to the bottom. And it needs to be focused around winning. You may not necessarily always get there, but you have to make sure that you're taking chances and putting your team in the best position, right? You need to have some type of identity. And it's hard to keep or create a certain type of identity when you're limited in certain situations, right? Maybe certain free agents aren't available. Maybe you don't have the financials to do it. But one thing that I think is important in those situations that we've seen from a few teams, say, for example, like the Nets or for the Knicks, is that you can't get rid of your resources. You can't just pay a bunch of people, or you can't do bad trades, right, just to try to like get a player that you think is going to make your team better, because it's the NBA and it's constantly changing. You still have to just develop the people that you have there, make smart moves, don't put yourself in a bind, stay committed to your system as much as possible. And then you really have to just develop those young guys to both buy into the system, right? And then also one of the words that you used was basically like open up, right? Expand their skill sets, right? Like unlock it, right? That was it, right? They need to be able to unlock it. So unlock all the potential of your players. A lot of that should come from the coaches, but a lot of that should also come from the team mentality, right? If there's not a team mentality to shoot threes, to be free, then that would never even happen, right?
Yeah, and I think, honestly, a lot of it is just luck. It's the right situation. It's the right ping pong balls in the draft lottery. You just never know. If the Bulls got Magic Johnson, what happens, right? You just have to do your best to assemble the team that works and keep trying to make the move. If anything happens differently with the Warriors, with their roster, does Steve Kerr have 5 straight finals and he looks like the greatest coach that's ever coached, right? Any one little thing can be different. So I think you have to do your best to help your team win and to put your team in that position. But if you don't succeed, I don't feel like there's a reason to say that you didn't do well. You might not make a dynasty. You might end up like the Bills or the Vikings in the 70s. You might end up like that where you get so close but don't win. There's a lot of teams that are also Rams that are actually really good teams. No one would say the Utah Jazz of the late 90s weren't good, or that they weren't good for the entire decade, right? But you have to do your best to put your team in a position to win. And whatever happens at that stage, you just have to be okay with it because there's nothing else you can do.
Yeah. And just a takeaway from this, and one thing that I just thought about is that nowadays with how the league is, with free agents, with analytics, with injury, with game management, with how many minutes they're playing, right? How easy is it? Easier now, or is it harder to have a dynasty? Like, are we ever going to see any more great dynasties, especially in like the football world after the Pats of it's post Brady, right? Or in the basketball world with all these athletes just being so much better, or the scouting prospects. Like, you have people that are at one point in time, like, they didn't have as many African Americans in the league, right? Like, that changed around the whole thing, right? So when you're comparing old dynasties to new, right? Like, what is that, right? Or you have a lot of AAU stuff where players aren't getting lost in different things, right? Getting arrested for small things, and their whole basketball career is thrown off, right? I feel like right now there's a totally different game than how it's been before, and I question how easy it is to make a competitive dynasty for certain types of teams, especially those small market, but even the ones that are big market, just because there's so many big market teams now. So I don't know. I think it's just an interesting concept to kind of like think about, especially like going towards the future.
Yeah, I think you have a point. I think it's harder now than before, but the game does change, and it's just hard to say what changes in the game will make it easier maybe to establish a dynasty. Like, the reason why all the best teams were from the 20s and 30s is just because the games weren't as competitive. Baseball, the Yankees won so many championships in, say, the 20s to the 50s because the competition was different. When you got the best players, you could keep them for their entire careers, right?
Yeah.
Easy, no free agency. there's no players asking for trades or whatever. I mean, you could just deny that. So it was easy, right? So I think that's why it is interesting that teams that can establish dynasties now, how are they able to do it? Because it's a lot harder with the salary caps, with free agency, with just more teams to have to compete against also, right? I mean, people rag on the Boston Celtics for winning in the league when the league had 8 to 14 teams, right? And it's easier. Yes, it is easier to win. So you can't deny that. Now, who knows what, maybe there wasn't a Charlotte Hornets team back then or whatever. That was just terrible. But, still, like the fewer the teams, the easier it was to win a championship.
Yeah, sure.
And so something like the team that we hadn't actually really talked about, the New England Patriots, that's what makes it really impressive what they're doing, because what they've been doing has spanned over almost 20 years now. They made the Super Bowl in basically half the seasons that they've been active in that 20-year span.
Yeah.
And they've been doing it with only really the quarterback as their one main guy. I mean, they've had linemen and defensive players come in and out that have been kind of a little more consistent, but they kind of built their team around the player. But they've had the coaching staff that's been able to kind of innovate and build them a system. I mean, I remember they had Wes Welker. They got rid of him. They got Amendola. Like, there was always some short white receiver that was like that same position. It wasn't even like the guy. It was the short white receiver position, right? So they had that thing. They knew exact what positions they wanted on the field to plug a guy in with the same skill set as the guy they just left. So what they did, I think, has been really impressive, as much as I hate to admit it. But to be able to stay competitive and just, they've been making Brady take less money somehow. They've convinced him that, hey, you want to win, take less money, give it back. Whatever they've been doing has been working this whole time. So I know we didn't really want to talk about them, but what they've done has been really impressive, because that's a team that every year you knew they were going to be a threat. And they took some time off, got their stuff together, came back, did it again. So, yeah, they've managed to be a threat for almost 20 years. Even when you thought they were gone, they came back. Yeah, so I think, what they've done is, in light of the restrictions, I think now, too, what they've done has been really impressive.
And I think that just closing out, one of the things to take away from what you just said was that they have a bunch of consistency with their system, right? They've had the same, owner. They've had the same, management. They've had the same coach. They've had the same quarterback. And they've had the same system. And for some reason, this system's been able to work over this long amount of time. And it really shows that there's a team aspect to winning, right? There needs to be some type of consistency that's there. There needs to be some type of identity. And without that, it's hard to win. There are some teams with some crazy identities, like the Raiders just want to be fast, and they're just like a fast team that just sucks, right?
But they're not getting players that, they get fast guys, but they don't get fast guys that can catch the ball, right? They fit the team, but for whatever reason, they don't have the exact right players that need to fit. But you also need to be able to adapt, right? Have your system. But when your system isn't the same, the Spurs system, this is where I'll give you the Spurs dynasty talk here. This is where I'll give in a little bit. Because the Spurs of 1999 played 1999 basketball. Yeah. They worked through their big men, right? They hit timely jumpers, but they weren't focused on that. Mm-hmm. Then as the years went on, they started working that three-pointer and that corner three that they were known for. They started really changing it inside out type thing. And by the time that it came to 2013 and 14, Danny Green was going to be the finals MVP when they lost to that year from shooting 27 threes or whatever, right? They just evolved this whole time. Mm-hmm. So evolution, if you can keep that same system in place, and the coach and all of his coaches know that they're going to have their jobs if they can tinker, then you got to be able to adapt and evolve. Yeah,
just evolve it, just like the Patriots with Brady. First he was more of a manager, and then he came the leader, right? So same thing. So it's all, you still have to evolve. You have to have a system, the coach, from top to bottom, have to have the draft picks. And I think that our final takeaway is just kind of it's hard to have a dynasty. It's not easy, or else we would see it a lot more often. It's just a hard thing to do. And that's why I think that these dynasties should really be kind of praised or recognized, because what they do is pretty amazing.
Right. A dynasty is hard to have. It's hard to even define. Therefore, if you have something even close to it, appreciate it, especially as fans. Appreciate when your team is good, because it's not always going to be good. So appreciate it, and appreciate what these people are able to do to get to that point that makes your team so good.
Yeah. So outside of that, I think we had a good session today. Thank you for joining us again on Beyond Sports with Paul and Jeremy. I'm Paul.
I'm Jeremy.
Thank you guys for tuning in.